The Zelda the Zelda cycle is a phenomenon in which the Zelda audience declares that the new Zelda game is a disappointment and the last one was far superior. This is a phenomenon that has been studied since the mid 2000s or so, possibly even earlier than that. I've seen people refer to this issue since like A Link to the Past, right? I've seen people say that like A Link to the Past murdered Zelda, or that Ocarina of Time murdered Zelda, and that Majora's Mask murdered Zelda, and that Wind Waker murdered Zelda, and that Twilight Princess murdered Zelda, and that Skyward Sword murdered Zelda. Like again, we see this over and over and over again. This isn't a new thing, right? This is a reoccurring pattern when it comes to the Zelda fan base, right? And because of certain issues over the last decade, Skyward Sword being so poorly received and Breath of the Wild being so well received, right? Like, I think in a lot of ways, this terminology has kind of fallen by the wayside. It's not something you really hear people talk about often. And because of that, I do think it's going to be like a focus of mine going forward to kind of bring the term back because as I've played Tears of the Kingdom, as I've seen people's reactions to it, as I've seen like complete dipshits, try and downplay this game as the worst Zelda ever, looking at you, the lonely Goomba, like as I've seen like the attempts at like downplaying this game and writing it off and pretending that like this game wasn't impressive, like what it all boils down to really is that we're just seeing the Zelda cycle play out for Tears of the Kingdom. And to a certain extent, we're seeing it for Echoes of Wisdom already as well, right? With people calling it kitty and not liking the change in direction and stuff like that. But like, again, let's focus on Tears of the Kingdom now because that's the game that's been out for a year now, and it couldn't be more obvious that this game is still very popular. It's still very well regarded. It has a really strong following, and yet we're always told by the online gaming community that it doesn't, right? That this game was a disappointment, that it failed, that it didn't live up to expectations, that Nintendo completely dropped the ball when it comes to this release, right? They come out here and try really hard to to pretend as if like that that Tears of the Kingdom like fell short compared to other games, specifically like big third-party titles from other platforms, right? Awfully convenient how Zelda never seems to get overshadowed by other Nintendo-related developers. It's always these random third-party studios that are completely forgotten like 10 years later. Like again, we saw this happen with Tears of the Kingdom. We saw an attempt at this with Breath of the Wild, right? People tried damage controlling Breath of the Wild for years, but a lot of the arguments never really took off. With Tears of the Kingdom, like it felt like we went into it like full swing on the Zelda cycle. People were complaining about like the map usage, the reasoning of the map, and like the fact that it was a sequel, and like the fact that we didn't know a lot about it, right? Like, people were doing all this stuff to like concern troll about it, but what it all boiled down to, honestly, was just that they were honestly trying to find excuses to hate it, right? This is the core issue with the Zelda cycle, as I understand it, is that people are so attached to like the stuff that they grew up with that they are willing to religiously fight for it to the death, even if that means like downplaying future installments in the next series, right? So, people who grew up with the NES Zeldas, they're gonna hate A Link to the Past and everything that came after that. People who grew up with Ocarina of Time, they're gonna hate like Majora's Mask, right? People who grew up and Wind Waker, right? People who grew up with like Wind Waker are gonna hate Twilight Princess, right? Like again, it doesn't matter really how well these games like do or sell or whatever. Like the issue is just whether or not a narrative can take hold that this game is a particular disappointment or not. Like Skyward Sword is an interesting situation because, when that game first came out like 13 years ago, people really had this mindset that this was like one of the worst Zelda games ever, right? It was very difficult to come out and talk about how good Skyward Sword was back in the day. I know because I was there, right? People had it in their heads that this game was like going to kill the Zelda brand, that like there was no recovery for this, that like Nintendo was on the way out. And that was a mindset that like persisted all throughout like the Wii U generation the up until the Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild came out, right? It was a reoccurring thing. And of course, like other other Nintendo brands get their own like unique kind of like pretendo downplaying. Pokemon likes to pretend that the Pokemon audience likes to pretend that the games are disappointing, even though they're not. Now we have this like weird rivalry between 2D and 3D Mario, right? We have people who like complain about Metroid, like Fire Emblem Splatoon, right? Like how many times have you seen someone complain about like censorship in games and then immediately just go like, "Oh, this is almost as bad as when Fire Emblem did it." Like it's interesting, isn't it? How Nintendo is always presented as the bad guy in the video game sphere, right? And it's not because they're doing anything different or weird. Like people really simply want to see Nintendo fail. They have been trained to think that way from a very young age by corrupt gaming medias, the corrupt gaming media and the PlayStation Nation, right? I it's interesting seeing how watching old clips of XPlay, back in 2004, Adam Sessler, coming out and trying to tell us that like, oh no, 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 Nintendo's going to go out of business. They're going to go third party. Like, and again, that was a common sentiment at the time, right? That Nintendo would fold like Sega did and join like the real consoles, the big boy platforms. And that simply never happened. But there is no denying that there was a real big push for it. And all of this, the Zelda cycle, the contempt for 2D Mario, like the Pokemon thing, like all of it is like just an orchestrated thing to try and bring that reality to fruition, to try and ruin these brands, to try to like discredit Nintendo, to ruin Nintendo, to try and act as if like their games are not competitive. It's interesting seeing like how successful Tears of the Kingdom has been. It's objectively high Metacritic score, it's objectively high sales numbers. You know, um, Seeing how well it's done and still seeing like people seriously try to say it's like it was a disappointment, right? The game wasn't anything special. It's absurd. But we get this all the time. And then like when people come back like 10, 20 years later, like they realize just how good this game is, right? They realize how wonderful it is. Like I remember when I first played Twilight Princess, right? I remember I was expecting it to be the greatest game ever and I played it and it was kind of a disappointment, right? It was still good, but I didn't really enjoy it, right? And I didn't think it was like the greatest thing ever, right? And I was just kind of like, for me, it was a major learning experience, not to get too hyped up about this kind of thing and to just kind of take things as they come or whatever. But like, everyone else was doing this thing with like, oh, Twilight Princess, that was such a letdown. Oh, 8.8. Oh, the Zelda audience is embarrassing themselves by hyping up this trash game. Yeah, I'm playing through it again recently, and it's kind of dawned on me just how much better Twilight Princess is than other games that came out around the same time. Right, it is better than the late stage PS2 games. It is better than early PS3 games. It is better than like the games that we were told were good back then, right? Metal Gear Solid 4 was a way bigger disappointment, right? To Metal Gear fans. And yet that game was like critically lauded and worshipped for a really long time. Like until 5 came out, I don't think people were willing to be critical of Metal Gear Solid 4 at all, right? I think these days it's a bit more common to like to talk down to Metal Gear Solid 4 because people who aren't like blinded by uh their worship for Kojima are playing these games and evaluating them and realizing that they're not that good. But when you really stop and really process like what's going on here, like you develop this sense that none of these people complaining about Zelda are to be trusted, right? Like, I've been saying this for a long time. You either play Nintendo or you don't, right? Like you either like them or you don't know anything about them. And if you don't know anything about them, that's when you start getting aggressive and start like straight up making things up about the company, right? And I do think this is the pattern we've been seeing from a lot of these people. Like they're so desperate to pretend that Nintendo is bad that they're willing to make stuff up and just go full nonsensical, just like, oh, Nintendo has fallen off. Tears of the Kingdom is a bad game. No, it's not, and it never will be. And the years and new years will come, right? More people will play this game over the years, and they will, as they play through it, they will slowly start to fall in love with this masterpiece.